What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen and I am back with another true crime video. And as per usual, I am sick again. I cannot seem to escape it the past like 2 years now, but we're pushing through anyways. And today we're going to be speaking about another MMIW case, and this time it's from Bighorn County, Montana, which if you know, you know. Montana is one of the states with the highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous people, with Indigenous persons making up only 6.7% of the population, but somehow also making up 26% of missing persons cases, which is just absolutely wild. Now, there is an extensive history in this particular area of unsolved or very suspicious missing persons or deaths that have gone either uninvestigated or they've been deemed accidental due to exposure or alcohol and drug use. And there seems to be like no level of investigation going on behind the scenes. Now, I have gone deep into the history of MMIP in several videos, and I have them all in a playlist that I encourage you guys to look at. But long story short, this is a massive epidemic. According to a 2023 report, 4 out of 5 Indigenous women have experienced violence, and 40% of trafficking victims are Native. I heard that and about lost my mind. And then the most shocking is that murder is the third leading cause of death. And because so much goes unreported, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And today's case is just the absolute epitome of all of that. We are going to be speaking about the disappearance and death of 18-year-old Kaysera Stops Pretty Places. Authorities failed to file a police report, they failed to search for her, and they failed to properly investigate her death, and are pushing this idea that Kaysera was out partying with friends before laying face down under a pile of tree branches and dying. And for years, her family has done nothing but ask for a proper investigation and communication. So, as a bit of a background, Kaysera was born on August 14th, 2001 to Geraldine Bulltail Stops and Alan Stops. She has a huge family that all played a part in raising her and her Indigenous heritage. Her family members belong to Crow, Northern Cheyenne, Madan, Hidatsa, Arikara nations, and her grandmother, who was her legal guardian, raised her in the Hardin area for a good portion of her life. Now, Hardin is a pretty small town in Bighorn County with right under about 4,000 or so people, and it sits just outside of the Crow Reservation, which covers over 2.2 million miles in Montana. So she was legitimately smack in the middle of the county that has some of the worst MMIP rates in the entire country. Now, Kaysera was described by her family as being fun-spirited and loving. She had all sorts of interests and was never afraid to try anything. She was highly intelligent and was very physically inclined as well, playing basketball and football and wrestling, and she ran cross country. All the pictures of her, she's just doing so many different things. And she was also very creative. She was active in theater and choir, and she had hopes to eventually work in performing arts in some way, shape, or form after graduation. Kaysera was passionate about life and her people, and she has so many opportunities ahead of her. And this brings us to August 2019, when Kaysera mysteriously disappeared. Every third week of August, the Crow holds an annual fair in Bighorn County, and it's a week-long event bringing in over 50,000 people, and it's a way for families from all over to come together and celebrate their culture. There is art and dance and food and rodeos. It's a lot of fun. That summer, Kaysera had gone to stay with her Aunt Priscilla in Hardin to attend the fair with her family. There had been an incident at the fair that her family and many others believe could have played a part in the lack of investigation or possibly in her disappearance and death. One of the days that week, Kaysera went to the fair with her 15-year-old brother, who had recently been pretty badly injured and was in a wheelchair. And at these large events, they typically bring in law enforcement from surrounding towns and counties. There's a lot of people, so they have a large police presence, and for one reason or another, there ended up being an altercation between Kaysera's brother and a few of these officers. And Kaysera recorded the entire altercation, which consisted of multiple officers beating her wheelchair-bound brother. She posted this all to social media. Capturing something like that on camera, where there are these officers just beating a child, it gathered a lot of attention, and rightfully so. All of the officers ended up being identified and were punished in one way, shape, or form. It was never released for what they had done to him. And a few of those officers that were involved were actually deputies from Bighorn County. Now, thankfully, it seems like her brother was okay. Obviously, their officers were reprimanded. So the week just continued on. But you can see why her going missing and her case not really being investigated threw up a bunch of red flags for her family, because literally just days prior to her disappearance, she filmed something that got a bunch of Bighorn County officers in trouble. So after the fair ended, Kaysera actually decided to stay a few more days with her aunt Priscilla because she had just turned 18 earlier that month of August, and she wanted to celebrate with her friends and family. So on August 24th, 2019, Kaysera made plans to go out with her 17-year-old friend Nakia and her 19-year-old family member Isabella, but Kaysera would never make it home. And the only accounts that we have of what happened that night are directly from interviews with Nakia, because it took police until 2021 to release any details at all about the case. Yeah, you heard that right. So according to Nakia, the three had planned to go out that night with hopes of drinking and partying, celebrating her turning 18. And Isabella said that her boyfriend, Natosi, who was 23 years old at the time, would be able to purchase them alcohol. So that was what they called their buyer. Kaysera's family said that she got all dressed up. They were really excited. And then they headed over to Natosi's house on Rangeview Drive, which is in the southernmost neighborhood in Hardin, for a hopefully good time. After a few hours of drinking, things quickly went downhill. Now, according to reports and Nakia, sometime at around 3 a.m., Isabella and Natosi ended up getting into a verbal argument. And it eventually got to the point where he was refusing to let her leave. And Kaysera eventually stepped in, and the three girls headed out of the house saying, "Forget this, we're done, we're calling it a night." But Natosi followed them, and the argument continued outside. The argument ended up being loud enough that it got the attention of one of the neighbors. And so this neighbor began to repeatedly lock and unlock their car, like from the safety of their house, and turn on the lights and set off the alarm in hopes that it would stop this argument that was going on between all four of these individuals. And around the same time, Nakia claims that out of nowhere, a cop car sped by, and that is ultimately what sent everybody scattering in different directions. And allegedly, Kaysera was last seen running towards the yard of a nearby home, and from that point on, she was never seen again. When everyone finally came out of their hiding spots after they were scared by the cop car, Kaysera was nowhere to be found. Nakia and Isabella were calling out for her. They said that they searched the area, but there was just no sign of her. So they decided to head back toward Natosi's house to see if maybe she ran back that way. But before they could continue looking for her in that direction, Natosi pulled out of his driveway and started chasing Nakia and Isabella with his truck. So they had to completely abandon their search for Kaysera and instead were running through alleys and yards to try and get away from Natosi. Now, eventually he went back home and stopped chasing them, and at this point, Isabella was distressed and she wanted to leave. It was a very traumatic experience for her, but they still hadn't seen or heard Kaysera anywhere. And so ultimately, the decision was made that Nakia was a smart, responsible girl. She could take care of herself, and so they figured she was either on her way home already or she would be home soon. So Nakia and Isabella went back to Priscilla's house. And they arrived expecting Kaysera to already be there, but she wasn't. So Nakia claimed that she sat on the front porch waiting for her, but after a while, when she never showed up, Nakia gave up and headed home. And by the next morning, when everyone in the house woke up, when Kaysera's aunt woke up, when her grandmother woke up, there was still no sign of Kaysera. She was supposed to meet up with her mom that day to take a trip to visit family in North Dakota. And this was something that she was very excited for, and it had been planned for a while. So when she failed to show up to that as well, at this point, they knew that something had to be wrong. So that day, August 25th, Kaysera's grandmother, who again was her guardian, called and tried to report her as missing. But her fears were immediately dismissed and no report was taken. So at this point, her aunt Priscilla is like, no, something is very, very wrong here. And so Priscilla herself went to try and report Kaysera as missing again. Because Kaysera was last seen off of reservation land, she was technically in Hardin, which is in Bighorn County. The jurisdiction fell to Bighorn County Sheriff's Department, the same sheriff's department that she had just filmed days prior. And Priscilla spoke to Deputy Jeremy Middlestead, and according to Priscilla, he was not taking her seriously at all. Kaysera had a history of running away. I don't know how many times she had ran away before. I know it was at least once, and she'd also been hospitalized one time before for drinking. But despite those not at all being valid reasons to disregard a missing 18-year-old, she was shrugged off anyways. Authorities basically said, yeah, she's likely out partying, and protocol means we can't report her missing until 48 hours after she was last seen, which is a massive lie. And so her family waited the 48 hours. They had no choice but to do what the sheriff's department said because they wouldn't budge otherwise. And so 2 days later, on the 27th of August, her family went back into Bighorn County Sheriff's Department and asked to formally file a report because Kaysera had still not been home. They explained who Kaysera had been with, where she was last seen, and that even if she had been out partying, she would have been on social media still, but everything had gone silent. And while she had run away before, she would have had no reason to run away on a night when she was out celebrating her birthday with friends. That just didn't make any sense, and she was excited to travel the following day. Something was wrong, but the sheriff's department was still just waving it off and basically said, yeah, well, not much can be done. So Kaysera's family was completely left on their own. They spent the next few days attempting to locate her and piece together the events of that night. Meanwhile, there was no report made to the media by the sheriff's department. There was no organized search that was held by law enforcement. None of her family members, friends, or those that she was with that night were questioned. Absolutely nothing was done until it was too late. And this is a very, very common theme in these MMIP cases. Authorities in Bighorn got a call on August 29th, which was 5 days after Kaysera was last seen in those early morning hours. A jogger had been going down at Mitchell Avenue right by Rangeview Road and noticed there was an area behind a chain link fence in this backyard that just looked suspicious. There was a large pile of sticks and debris. I've seen that there were crows and birds around the area, and so that attracted his attention. And so he had this gut feeling to go back and check it out again, and when he did, to his horror, face down underneath this pile of debris was a body. Now, some reports have stated that there was also a plastic sheet on top of the body, but authorities will not confirm or deny this according to family, and I'm unsure where exactly that information originated from, but this was exactly the same location where Kaysera had gone missing just days prior. The house that she had been at drinking was only one house away from the backyard where this body was found. But despite this, her family was not notified that potential remains had been found and they could be Kaysera's because it all adds up. Authorities arrived on scene at 6:52 p.m. and by 7:30 a death pronouncement was made. Thankfully, a friend of Priscilla's somehow managed to find out about this body that was found and messaged her to let her know, saying, hey, something's up here. So frantically, Priscilla went to the location to try and identify the remains. She told the officer a description of Kaysera, that she had been reported missing. This was where she vanished, every bit of clothing she had on her, the way she had her hair last. The officer said that the remains had already been bagged up and moved to the state crime lab in Billings and refused to answer any further questions. So there was this lingering possibility that this was Kaysera, and nobody was communicating with her family about it at all. And over the next 2 days, there was still silence from Bighorn County Sheriff's Department, but there were plenty of rumors spreading on social media. And in specific, there was one, I think, going around on Twitter saying that the body that was found was in fact a, quote, stops girl. So on September 1st, just days after the body was found, Kaysera's grandmother and mom made their way to the only funeral home that is in Hardin, and it's called Bullis Mortuary, because they wanted answers. At this point, still zero communication from Sheriff's Department, so they figured maybe this is a way for us to get information. According to whoever they spoke to at this funeral home, they were told the remains were not Kaysera's, which is obviously a huge relief. So they did the only thing that they could do at this point. they just continued searching for her, believing that if these remains were not Kaysera, it was just some crazy coincidence and she was still out there somewhere. Numerous family members made the 100+ mile drive twice a day to search and to ask questions, but everyone just kept on coming up empty-handed until September 11th, almost 2 weeks after those remains had been found. Authorities reached out to Kaysera's family and said that the remains found on the 29th were actually, in fact, Kaysera. I have no idea why her family was told differently before this, but this was devastating. And to top it off, authorities failed to notify the entire paternal side of her family, including her father himself. Her family had done everything they could have. They reported her missing within hours. They had given authorities the last place she was seen. If they had just searched, if they had just done something, at the very least, her remains could have been found sooner. I mean, they couldn't even do the most basic thing, which was communication. So Kaysera's family was attempting to grapple with this huge loss while also feeling very neglected by the sheriff's department and confused as to what on earth could have possibly happened to Kaysera. She was only 18 years old, she was smart and resilient, she had been fine enough to help get her friend safely from the house. What happened between that moment and then running to the house next door that took her life? It literally made no sense at all. The following day of September 12th, Kaysera's mother, Geraldine, went to Bullis Mortuary for a second time, but this time it was to make arrangements for her daughter. She spoke to Terry Bullis, who was the owner of the mortuary and also the county coroner, and he told Geraldine that in order for her daughter to be returned to family, that he would have to cremate Kaysera as soon as possible. Obviously, Geraldine's like, full stop, hold on a second. She told Bullis that cremation goes against her beliefs. Crow Nation believes that if your body is cremated, you do not pass into the afterlife. So it is not something that they do, but he kept on insisting, if you want to have your daughter back as soon as possible, this needs to happen. She has to be cremated. So Geraldine pushed back and ended up asking for Kaysera's remains to be transported to a trusted funeral home in Billings. But Bullis all of a sudden stepped into his role as county coroner and tells her no. And after what I'm sure was a very exhausting and devastating conversation for a grieving mother, he scheduled a cremation anyway. She signed everything. He collected payment for it that day, and the plans moved forward without him ever speaking to any other family members. And if you are familiar at all with typically how things like cremation go, and this isn't going to go all the way across the board, there's always going to be exceptions, but most of the time they want as many signatures as possible on the documents where you're agreeing to a cremation, because there's a lot of feelings and things involved in that. And so it's not very common for someone to accept one signature and then just kind of call it at that. Especially, when there's a guardian also involved, then there's the two parents. I can't imagine what kind of experience that was for Geraldine. And if you've ever lost someone very close to you and you're having to deal with all those arrangements, it is very easy because of your grief to end up being manipulated or taken advantage of, because it's overwhelming and it is a lot. Now, over the next few days, Kaysera's family attempted to visit the exact area where her remains were found to try and get some sort of idea of what may have happened. And they ended up having to get help from someone in the area because still authorities had told them nothing. And as they were wandering around searching for the exact location, they're like, we can't find any signs that there had been a body here. Like, there was no tape anywhere. There wasn't even like an impression in the ground. Like, there was no sign. You would never know that Kaysera had laid in one of these backyards for 5 days. And once they were able to find the location, they were shocked. Now, I obviously will have videos, photos, all sorts of things on the screen, but like I've already stated, it was directly next door to the home that she had been in the night that she disappeared, which is frustrating because that would have taken all of like 15 minutes of authority searching for them to have found her remains sooner. Not just that, she was right on the other side of a chain link fence, like right at the corner of this person's backyard, and it's only feet away from the road, and this isn't just a quiet residential road. The road that Kaysera was found off of, literally within feet of, is one of just a handful of main roads in Hardin. And it's also one of the very main roads that goes straight down through the reservation, like connecting it to all of the northern cities that are in Montana. And according to reports, a car passes down this road at least every 30 seconds. It's also frequently traveled on foot by people walking their dogs or obviously joggers. Now, granted, I don't think there's a sidewalk on that side of the road. It's on the other side. But regardless, this is not a barren road in the middle of nowhere. So the idea that Kaysera's body had been in this yard for 5 days before it was found, like literally right at the edge for everyone to see, was so strange. And thankfully, they were also able to speak to the homeowner, and he told the family that he was very meticulous about keeping his yard clean. So how on earth did not only she end up in such an obvious place, but why was she under this large pile of tree branches that he wouldn't have just had piled in his yard like that to begin with? Which, as a side note, I have seen that this particular neighbor was actually out of town, at least when she was found. I don't know if he was out of town during the disappearance, but anyways, the neighbor was very accommodating for the family, which was probably one of the first times anyone else had been that way towards them. He let them perform a ceremony for Kaysera in the backyard, and honestly, I'm so thankful that they at least had some sort of positive experience throughout these initial first weeks. But they also were able to speak to the person that found Kaysera's remains, because this person also lived just like a few houses away. And he immediately raised red flags because he said he was very concerned about the investigation that authorities did. Now, according to this witness, he obviously called police, said that he found a body, but he stuck around while they were there kind of investigating the scene and processing everything. And the first thing that he noticed is that they failed to secure the scene at all. Now, typically things are cordoned off, people stand watch, only certain people are allowed in and out of a scene, but there was absolutely none of that. He said that he ended up calling them out on it, but his concerns were just kind of disregarded and brushed away. He also noticed that they had pulled a phone out of Kaysera's pocket, and he told her family that he had encouraged authorities to charge it. It was dead, but he's like, that is the best and fastest way to figure out who she is, figure out who her family is, get in contact with someone who's probably worried about her. But just like his worries over the scene itself, this was also just shrugged off, and they never did anything with it. Kaysera's family at this point had so many questions, so many concerns, and absolutely no answers. How on earth does a family get almost a month into their loved one being missing and found deceased, and authorities have not spoken to them? Calls were made, emails were sent, but there was no response. Days later, on September 16th, Kaysera's family headed back to Bullis Mortuary for her visitation and to pick up her ashes, because these were the only things they had any control over at this point. And when they got there, they were told that her remains weren't even there, and people seemed to have no idea where they were. I cannot even begin to imagine that level of distress hearing that. And after waiting for about 45 minutes, they were told that her remains probably wouldn't even make it that day, and also likely wouldn't be there for the funeral the following day, which is absolute madness. And as if this wasn't already a nightmare situation, her family was in a roundabout way told to leave after getting this news because the business had to clean up to close for the day. Unprofessional, insensitive, I could just keep on. Kaysera's family refused, thankfully, and demanded to stay until her remains arrived. They're like, nope, we are paying you for this. Like, you wanted this. We're having to follow through with it now. Like, we're staying until she gets here. Thankfully, Kaysera's remains did arrive at around 5:30 p.m. And honestly, I am so proud of them for standing their ground. But unfortunately, it just goes downhill again, which just seems to be the theme of this entire case. After the visitation, family members went to Terry Bullis to ask questions about what to expect next. There's no handbook or guide on how to navigate situations like this, and they're not being told by anyone what to expect and timeframes and what's happening, and if there's an investigation. They are literally just having to get any tidbit they can from anyone willing to talk to them. And so they wanted to know, when's the autopsy report going to come back? When's the coroner report going to be ready? Because that might tell us something about what happened. And he told them that it would likely take weeks, which is pretty normal, except he then went on to assume what those reports would say. And without any evidence at all, any reports being back, no toxicology report was done, nothing, he told her family that he believed Kaysera died from alcohol or drug use. And it wasn't until September 19th, almost a month from the moment that Kaysera disappeared, that her family finally was able to sit down and speak with investigators. An entire month. And that's after they had to hire an attorney and send notarized requests to both Bighorn County and Bullis Mortuary demanding information. Now, they were able to sit down with Captain Mike Fuss, who, according to family, seemed to have no idea who they were, no idea what they were there for, thought they were there for like a cell phone or something. When they finally said who they were and he connected the dots, he didn't even seem to know the most basic information, like who Kaysera's guardian was, probably because no one spoke to her family. And when they confronted him, about why they had gone an entire month without any communication, he basically said he was just working other cases and didn't get around to it. I know that police departments can get backed up. There can be a huge caseload on a lot of these officers and detectives and all of that, but an entire month. He went on to say that Jeremy Middlestead, the same man Priscilla had reported Kaysera missing to initially, had been on the case at first, but he had recused himself because he, quote, couldn't handle it, which I've got no idea what that means. Even then, he didn't seem to have any information he was giving to the family about the case. All he really had to say was that Jeremy Middlestead had originally been the investigator, and this was who Priscilla had reported Kaysera missing to. And he recused himself shortly after because he, quote, couldn't handle it, whatever that means. So Fuss said that he had since taken over. I don't know if he was using that to say that's why I don't know much or this, that, or the other, but regardless, Kaysera's family came prepared with a very long list of questions, understandably, including why it took so long to identify Kaysera, why their family was never notified that remains had been found, why the scene was never secured, and why Kaysera's phone was never utilized to locate family or to help identify her. And what Mike Fuss went on to say, just so casually, absolutely blows my mind. According to Kaysera's family, Mike Fuss said that Terry Bullis had, quote, snatched the body from the state crime lab to take back to his own personal funeral home before any identification had been made. So it caused a huge holdup. It turned out they had to actually get a subpoena to retrieve the body back from Bullis Mortuary, who apparently wouldn't hand it back over, and send it back to the state lab in Billings under police escort to make sure that it wasn't taken again. Because according to some reports, he took the body a couple of times, which I'm just over here like, I have so many questions. Like, why did the state lab release it to Terry Bullis if they hadn't even finished their job yet? Like, how are bodies just being transported willy-nilly like this? And the only thing that I can think of is he showed up and was like, I'm the county coroner where she was found. Like, I'm taking it back to look into, but then why did he take it to his personal funeral home? It's just absolutely bizarre to me. But once her body was taken back to the state lab, which was done on the 9th of September, that's when they were finally able to identify her through dental records. So even once they did identify Kaysera, it still took them 2 days to notify her family. And they knew about her family because her family had been repeatedly reaching out to them, asking about what was going on with their missing loved one. Another really strange fact in all of that is that they were told that she had to be identified through dental records because of the advanced stage of decomposition. She was found 5 days after she went missing, and at that point she would have been just starting or about to be starting active decomposition. So at first I thought that maybe all of the time spent at Bullis Mortuary and getting the subpoena to get her remains back and all of that time passing had something to do with it. But according to a statement made by Dr. Robert Kurtzman, the Montana chief medical examiner at the time, her remains were very decomposed when they were found. How on earth did Kaysera's remains get so decomposed in just a matter of 5 days? It felt like something was so wrong here, and then when you add the fact that it was pushed for cremation, no one was able to see Kaysera. What in the world is going on? Mike Fuss also didn't seem to have any explanation as to why no family members had been notified when those remains were found in the first place. And it's common practice to reach out to these families when remains like this are found so they don't have to hear something like that from the news, or, because there wasn't even any news on this, from a friend on Facebook who just so happened to hear it through the grapevine. Mike Fuss then went on to explain why the scene hadn't been secured, and his explanation makes no sense unless I just have a completely false understanding of how to properly handle a potential crime scene. So you guys let me know if you've ever heard this before, but he basically explained that the only time a crime scene has to be secured is if an investigator is not the first person on the scene. But if the investigator is also the responding officer, they don't have to secure it, and he claims that is what happened. And to answer their concerns over the cell phone, he said the same thing that they told the person that called 911 in the first place, that it was dead, so they couldn't get any information off of it. And he even said that he was surprised they knew about that cell phone being in evidence. But when her family pushed like the witness had, saying you could have easily charged this, Mike Fuss pushed back, saying that even if it was charged, the FBI can't even break into a phone like that. And in the same breath, asked them to sign a release for Kaysera's phone and social media. So I'm just over here like, what's the truth? Like, do you not know anything about the case, or do you know everything that's in evidence, like you apparently do and are shocked other people do? Are you able to get into the phone, or are you not able to get into the phone? I feel like it's just a bunch of contradictions so far. While the meeting answered a few questions, they still felt that they were being dismissed. And so more family members ended up meeting with the Bighorn County attorney, Jay Harris, to try and get more information. And he seemed to know just as little as everybody else. He had no idea who the lead investigator was, and admitted that the sheriff's department was in a state of utter chaos. And when Kaysera's family asked why there was no investigation being done, he asked how they knew that there wasn't. But their response quickly pointed out that authorities hadn't even spoken to Kaysera's family members until that day, which is the first and most basic step of an investigation. So common sense says there hadn't been an investigation. They also reached out to Deputy Attorney General about the lack of action and communication in the case, and she said that they were rightfully upset. At this point, they just wanted to speak to anyone that would talk to them about Kaysera. And she said that anyone under the age of 20 in Montana has to be reported as a missing child. And not just that, they have to be reported within a matter of hours after the family reaches out. I can't remember the exact time frame. I think it might be like 2. Don't quote me on that. Bighorn County failed to do that. They had to go back 3 times to try and report Kaysera as missing. So she told the family she was going to look for Kaysera's missing child report to try to see what information she could find to give the family something. And surprise, surprise, there was never a missing child report filed. Kaysera was never filed at all as a missing person. So the idea that they had to go 3 times to begin with and wait 48 hours to report her as missing was already bad enough, knowing that she should have been reported missing within a couple of hours. But to know that they went those 3 times and were lied to, and when they came back, when they were told to, she still wasn't filed as missing, was infuriating. Her family continued reaching out to everyone because not only did they feel like they were being ignored by the sheriff's department, but there also had been nothing on the news. Usually when someone goes missing, their face is on the news, or there's an Amber Alert sent out if that fits, or there's something out there, but no one had reported on Kaysera, not when she went missing, not when remains were found, and not when she was identified. And so they reached out to Billings Gazette to say, hey, why haven't you said anything about this? And they said they didn't know that it had happened. They had apparently been in contact with Bighorn County Sheriff's Department daily. They called them every single day to try to get the most current news. And typically during those calls, something like Kaysera's disappearance and death would have been put out there. Because keep in mind, it is still an open investigation. They don't know if there's foul play involved. They don't know if there's a killer out there. They don't know anything. But in this entire time, over a month's worth of phone calls, the sheriff's department never mentioned Kaysera to the Billings Gazette a single time. That's madness. So when you stop and take a second to look at this case, there's no telling if evidence has been lost. There's no telling if someone may have had a tip that now they weren't going to call in, or they wouldn't know to call in because there had been no media presence on the case. There were so many missteps already. When Kaysera's family was finally able to meet with the actual sheriff, Sheriff Big Hair, who by the way has a very, very long history, he agreed that things were not handled properly, thankfully, and eventually he ended up assigning them a victim's advocate, which is a step in the right direction, I guess, but he gave them the wrong phone number. Anyways, and he also told them if they wanted the FBI to be involved, they could reach out, because her family says, look, we're not getting anything from you. We are not confident in your investigation. We want someone else to look into this. And so once they got the green light from him, that's exactly what Kaysera's family did, because it was obvious that her death was not a priority to investigators at the sheriff's department. Even the captain, who was the new investigator on the case, basically admitted it when he said that he was working other cases for the entire first month of what should have been an investigation into her death. But this is unfortunately where the jurisdictional issues really come into play. Now, reservation land is typically managed on a federal level, aside from local authorities within the reservation, if there even are any, which sometimes there are not. However, when they reached out to the FBI, they were basically told, you have to prove and provide more evidence in a case that's not been investigated to prove that Kaysera was killed on reservation land in order for us to help. They basically didn't want to touch it unless they absolutely had to. Kaysera was found 300 yards away from Crow Reservation. I'm going to put up a picture right here of how close to Crow Reservation she was, and they said no. What the heck are you supposed to do when there is nobody dedicated to actually finding answers and the truth, and nobody wants to take responsibility for the case? Her family just continued to be turned in circles, with everyone pointing the finger at someone else who could help or had answers, only for them to be led back to the start. For example, they wanted to try to get the death certificate for Kaysera. Again, they just wanted something at all, and so they went to Terry Bullis, and he said, nope, I don't do that. You have to go to this other office. And so they went to that office. I think it was like where you get marriage certificates, death certificates, all of that. And they're like, no, we don't do that. You need to go to Terry Bullis. And like, everyone was just pointing them around, running them in circles, and nothing productive was getting done. So they started to protest for justice at the courthouse. Everyone had freaking had it. And they're like, we are not doing this anymore. Someone is going to listen. And these protests weren't just about Kaysera's case, but also the 20-some other MMIP cases that were in the area that had also gone unsolved, and it gathered a lot of attention. And so in response to this, by October 1st, 2019, Attorney Jay Harris announced that he was starting a new task force, the Bighorn County Missing and Murdered Persons and Investigation Task Force, which sounds like it could be great. He said that it was supposed to help solve these cases, like Kaysera's, with a more unified response, that it would help connect all these different government levels. It was this beautiful idea put out there, wrapped with a pretty bow. Despite launching this new task force and claiming it was going to do all these great things, Attorney Jay Harris still brushed off Kaysera's family the next time they went to speak to him. And Attorney Jay Harris apparently crossed his arms and told her family he wasn't comfortable talking about it. Her family was shocked and ended up handing him his very own media release that directly speaks about him being a supervisor over all suspicious deaths and homicides in the county now. When he had announced that new task force, he put himself at the head of it. He assumed a lot of responsibility. He said, quote, "It may be unprecedented in Bighorn County for the county attorney to take such an active role, but our community finds itself in unprecedented times," end quote. How are you going to assume the role of supervising these cases and then tell families of these cases that you don't feel comfortable talking about said cases? And I just want to pit stop here and say that this is another huge theme in MMIP cases. It is like a giant game of pass the baton. Nobody wants to claim jurisdiction or responsibility, and it just throws these cases and these people and their families into a black hole. But after having his own words thrown back at him, which good, Attorney Jay Harris finally started to give some information. Now, remember Jeremy Middlestead was the original investigator on the case. He was the same man that took the missing persons report and never actually filed it. Well, he recused himself, which we already know, almost immediately. When going into this case, when her remains were found, he was put on the case, he immediately recused himself off of it. And according to Attorney Hayes, after this, there was a gap in the investigation. Due to personnel issues, that first week after Kaysera's remains were found, They didn't even have anyone to assign the case to. So it just sat there. Months passed at this point with many more forms for information being filed. I mean, her family was told to do all sorts of things, jump through all sorts of hoops, speak to all sorts of people. Promises were made to have meetings with the attorney general, with all these different individuals, but no one ever held up their end of the agreement or even gave the family proper information. Like, they would be told to do something and they do it and then wonder why they got no response, and someone else would be like, oh, well, they told you wrong. You actually have to do it this way. And I mean, could you just for a second think about what an absolute nightmare it would be to deal with something like that? I cannot even imagine how frustrating that feels. Finally, on January 19th, 2020, an article was released in the Billings Gazette, and this announced the cause and manner of death. Months after Kaysera had disappeared and her remains were found, which it can take a while, but usually not this long. The cause and manner of death could not be determined. And I have no idea if this information was relayed to the family through authorities or through a medical examiner, coroner, someone, or if they found out through this article. And it is one of the only articles that I have seen with this information in it. And while I've seen it stated that Bullis performed an autopsy himself on August 30th, so I guess this is when he went and initially snatched the body, this article states that the results came from an autopsy done by a state medical examiner. So I'm like, well, who did the autopsy? Like, did they just have two different reports? Like, I don't understand how, like, there's no explanation to any of this. But ultimately, they found no injuries, no sign that there had been a natural death. There was pretty much nothing. They were able to rule out a few things. They did state they were not specific on what, but there was nothing in the autopsy or toxicology report that was conclusive. So her death was classified as suspicious. I would think that maybe at this point, with this information coming out, that there would be some sort of meeting or conversation about what steps are going to be taken next in the investigation. But from my understanding, there was still a lack of communication and effort. Her family had still not been formally questioned. And they had no idea if those with Kaysera had been questioned. And they just felt like all of this was a way to shut the investigation down once and for all, make it a big question mark and sweep it under the rug. So they continued on advocating for Kaysera and every other Indigenous person that this has ever happened to. They also started making some big moves. They had their attorney file to have Terry Bullis's license revoked as they felt that he had forced Geraldine into a cremation and seemed to have a serious conflict of interest. They believed that he was funneling his personal mortuary money through these death investigations that he was supposed to be doing as a coroner. He was just like filling his pockets, and this wasn't the first time that his ethics had been questioned. Now, I went and looked it up to see what exactly happened when his ethics had first been questioned. So back in 2003, Terry Bullis had a complaint lodged against him for embalming the body of a woman from a car accident without permission from family at all. According to the complaint, he had acted as county coroner to gain access to the body, and then he took it back to his personal funeral home, which sounds awfully familiar. He then failed to reach out to anyone, failed to try to find some sort of identification, which again, car accident, think things like, look in the purse, look for an ID, a phone, something, and he immediately embalmed her instead. Now, when her family ultimately ended up finding out about her death, they attempted to have her remains transported to a funeral home near them in Lame Deer, which is a neighboring town. And they had a man named Fred Rausch to do this. He owned his own funeral home. And when Fred arrived, Bullis refused to release her remains until the woman's family paid the money for these services that he hadn't even been asked or approved to do. And they were infuriated. Now, they paid him. Fred Rausch said during all of this that this was a very routine thing for Bullis, to the point that Fred said that he brought cash with him anytime that he had a pickup from Bullis because there was no telling what services he had provided that he would demand payment for in order to release the body. But ultimately, the board decided that they had never had any complaints about this before. It was the first time they were hearing about it. Bullis was forced to take ethics classes due to the behavior. He had to repay the family, and then he was placed on professional probation for a year. But after that, he just freely continued on with his job as both a county coroner and a local mortuary owner. Now, when it came to Kaysera, family members had actually confronted him at some point before this about him saying that cremation was the only way to get Kaysera back to her own mother. And when he was confronted about this, he admitted it. He said, yeah, I did tell her that she would have to cremate the remains, even though it goes against her personal beliefs. And when they asked, was that really the only way? Like, legitimately, was that the only option? He said, no, but it was the simplest. So he lied and took advantage of a grieving mother going against her cultural beliefs because it was easiest for him and made him more money. But ultimately, it was decided that he technically did not do anything illegal. There was nothing unlawful about what happened, that he just didn't ask for permission, quote, in the best way possible. I've never heard anything like it. Now, Bullis has since passed, but the person that took over after him also went on a rampage of sorts and ended up with a warrant out for his arrest. So really things are just not looking good over there. So Kaysera's family could do nothing about the fact that the funeral home acted horribly towards them multiple times, could do nothing about the fact that it didn't seem like there was an investigation going on. They had tried every avenue, every person they could reach out to, everything possible to have someone help them and figure out what happened to Kaysera. Finally, in 2021, due to public outcry, the Bighorn County Attorney's Office released a report on the investigation into the death of Kaysera. And according to the report, the hope was to basically ensure that the public had confidence in their investigation. They wanted to be transparent. It took them 2 years, but I digress. However, they never reached out to her family with this information first. The people that deserved it and had spent time and money repeatedly requesting case files and documents and meetings and got nothing. Now, I have the whole entire report down below that you can check out, but basically it just gave details I've already given throughout the rest of this video. But there's also this aspect in it where they seem to try to justify their own shady actions. They admit to the wrongdoings, but try to explain it away. They admitted that there was no missing persons report ever filed, but then went on to immediately say that she had gone missing before, and as if that was justification to ignore her disappearance. And they also admitted that from the date of the autopsy on August 30th all the way to September 19th, no investigative efforts were conducted. So that whole, someone was just off it for a week thing was not true. It had actually been like 20 some days that no one investigated into Kaysera's death. But there was absolutely no explanation given as to why. And then they brought up the autopsy, and it was stated that the toxicology did in fact show that she had a 0.149 blood ethanol level. And they proceeded to say that it was very similar to the levels found when she was hospitalized for drinking, according to school and medical records they pulled, which irked me because they were able to pull school records and medical records, but couldn't speak just directly to her family. They also said that she had been diagnosed with asthma. They just added that in there. And so it really felt like they were suggesting that she drank too much, climbed a fence, and died under a pile of sticks somehow. It was honestly the most bizarre thing to read. And her family said that it seemed like more of a character attack, like they investigated into her character more than it was an overview of their actual investigative efforts into her death. And it's even more upsetting in regards to those ethanol levels because, again, it was really suggestive, just like Terry Bullis had said, that she died from drinking alcohol. But keep in mind, numerous different professionals up at the state crime lab saw that number and did not determine that the death was from alcohol. So why were they so insistent on pushing that? More experts had even come forward and stated that the ethanol produced from decomposition could have easily contributed to those levels. So there's no way to say if that was from alcohol consumption or not. Based on what was said, she was, level-headed and there enough to know that the argument wasn't okay, to intervene, to safely get all three of them out of the house, to run off. And so the idea that she ran off and then jumped this fence and right then and there died from alcohol poisoning or something is just not making any sense still. But it also says in the report that they were unable to rule out asphyxia, which could be caused by severe asthma attack, which is maybe why they pointed that out, or strangulation. And they couldn't say either way. It was also stated that they had in fact interviewed witnesses, but they didn't state who exactly they had interviewed. And according to the most recent statements from family, it definitely wasn't them. So does that mean that authorities spoke to Nakia and Isabella and Natosi, the last people to see her? Then they also went a little more in depth in this report about forensics, something that also had never been spoken about before. Now, the report says that samples were in fact taken from Kaysera on her fingernails. There were other locations around her body that they took samples from, and no foreign DNA was present in any of the samples. And that seems to be the totality of forensics done, or at least the only thing that authorities were willing to tell anyone about. There was also a bit of insight into trying to pass this investigation around. It was stated that they attempted to hand the case over in January of 2020 to the DOJ, but they were denied, and so eventually they just handed it to a cold case unit. But that cold case unit simply did a review of the information that had already been collected, which was not much, and no further investigative efforts were done. And I get that not everything can be released to protect the integrity of the investigation, but how on earth do you investigate someone's death and disappearance without formally interviewing that person's family that she lived with, that she spent majority of her time with? So to me, this lack of information, even in this transparent report, makes it clear that it is very obviously more so a lack of investigative efforts than an effort to remain tight-lipped about information they have. Now, ultimately, they ended it saying that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had offered their assistance and Bighorn County accepted. And this was huge. This is what everyone kind of wanted. They wanted more eyes on this, new techniques, new tactics, people who were actually going to continue investigating and not just review what was done. And so everyone was hopeful this would bring forward information. A year later, in an article done by The Guardian in 2022, Attorney Jay Harris still seems to have this energy. He's confirming that local law enforcement are still working on Kaysera's case, that they're working alongside the MMU. And from the outside, it looked like there was work being done, but it was all smoke and mirrors. After this article was released, according to both the family's attorney and the Bureau of Indian Affairs themselves, the MMU was not looking into the case. So Jay Harris straight up lied to make it look like there was an investigation happening when there wasn't. This whole case is just so heartbreaking and infuriating, and it seems there is just still no current investigation, and Kaysera's family is still waiting for answers, and their hands are tied. There's only so much they can do. They seem to have a great attorney that is pushing every avenue she possibly can to figure this out, and it's just not going anywhere. This whole idea that Kaysera ran a few hundred feet and died under this pile of branches is just very unbelievable, in my opinion. At the very least, this is a wildly incompetent county as a whole. Now, I recently watched a documentary on Kaysera's case and two others. It's called Murder in Bighorn, and you can buy it on Amazon. It's also available on Peacock. It's a 3-part series, but I highly, highly encourage you guys to go and check it out. You get to hear from these families directly and the history of their own personal experiences that may help you understand the full impact of MMIP and in turn, Kaysera's case. And the other two girls also apparently just, walked out of a party or walked off from friends a few hundred feet and laid down and died. And that is just the most BS thing that I have ever heard. Now, obviously, accidents happen, things happen, but for this to happen to so many young girls specifically in this area, it's just not feeling right. So not only are you able to hear about all 3 girls and what happened to them in Murder in Bighorn, but also there's so much educational information in there. There's so many lived experiences. And I feel like it is one of the best things I've watched to date that really shows the reality of what is happening and how it is affecting so many people. Now, while there have been some recent law changes and improvement in some areas in terms of handling these cases, there just in general needs to be a huge overhaul. When everyone has a sister, a mother, a cousin, or brother missing, there is a serious, serious problem. I don't know if we'll ever know what exactly happened to Kaysera when you so quickly drop the ball on a case and don't gather all the information you can and all the evidence you can right away, a lot of that stuff is gone and you can never get it back. That is why it is so, so crucial for people to be reported missing right away, for authorities to start investigating right away. There's like this golden opportunity of time and they didn't take it. And on that note, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and go. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Kaysera's story. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallen fam so we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video.